She had always preferred the quiet hours. While the other recruits crowded the mess hall during the brief window of free time, laughing too loud and trading stories of home, Maya was a ghost, slipping away to the one place she felt a sense of peace: the armory. It wasn't just the smell of gun oil and cold steel that drew her there. It was the promise of perfection. To the untrained eye, a rifle was a rifle. To Maya, it was a symphony of interconnected parts, each one a potential point of failure or a source of flawless harmony. Sergeant Major Harrison, the grizzled veteran who guarded the armory like a dragon hoarding gold, had long stopped questioning her presence. He'd simply nod, hand her the keys to the cleaning station, and return to his paperwork, the scratch of his pen a familiar rhythm in the background. For Maya, this was meditation. She'd lay out the components of an M24 sniper weapon system: the stock, the action, the heavy barrel, with the reverence of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Her fingers, calloused yet impossibly delicate, would dance over the bolt, feeling for the slightest imperfection in its travel. She'd inspect the crown of the barrel, the rifling inside, ensuring every groove was pristine, ready to impart that perfect spin on a bullet. Her own rifle was a part of her. She knew its temperament, its little quirks. She knew how the point of impact shifted with a 5-degree temperature change, or how a humid morning would make the stock swell just a fraction of a millimeter. The other soldiers in her battalion, the 3rd Infantry Division, knew her as the quiet one, the woman with the intense focus who could field strip a weapon in under a minute blindfolded. They respected her skill, but they didn't quite understand it. To them, she was the armorer's unofficial apprentice, a necessary but background component of the unit's lethality. That was until the day the 1st Armored Division rolled in for the joint training exercise. They were the hotshots, the ones with the state-of-the-art gear and the swagger to match. And leading their sniper section was a man the others simply called Preacher. He was tall, with a lantern jaw and eyes the color of slate, eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating wind speed and distance. He'd earned his nickname not from any religious affiliation, but from the sermons he'd delivered to his spotter about the ballistic trajectory of a round as if he were quoting scripture. The joint exercise was a week of war games designed to foster interdivision cooperation. It meant shared barracks, shared chow halls, and most critically, a shared schedule on the ranges. The first few days were tense but professional. Then came the live fire qualification day for the sniper sections. Both divisions would be on the same range, a sprawling, dusty expanse with targets popping up at unknown distances, from 300 meters out to a daunting 1,000. Maya wasn't shooting that day. Her role was support. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in hues of orange and gold, she was in the armory tent, putting the final, meticulous touches on the rifles for her battalion's shooters. She was lost in her work, head bent low, a jeweler's loupe magnifying her right eye as she used a brass rod and a phosphor bronze brush to gently scrub carbon fouling from the throat of a barrel. The sounds of the range filtered in, the distant crack of rifles, the tinny voices over the radio net, the low murmur of soldiers waiting their turn. It was then that the tent flap rustled, and a shadow fell over her workbench. She didn't look up, assuming it was one of her guys coming to check on their weapons status. "Heard you were the best set of hands in the division," a voice drawled. It was a voice used to giving orders, or maybe just used to being listened to. Maya glanced up. It was Preacher. He was leaning against the tent pole, cleaning his own sidearm with a rag, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the array of tools and rifles laid out before her with an air of amused condescension. Maya returned her gaze to her work. "Just doing my job," she murmured. "Yeah, I see that." He gestured with the rag toward the rifle in her hands. "Pretty work, real pretty. But it's one thing to make 'em pretty, it's another to make 'em sing." He holstered his sidearm and walked closer, peering at the intricate bolt assembly she had just finished cleaning. "My grandma could clean a rifle. Doesn't mean she could hit a barn door from the inside with it." A few of his men who had been waiting outside chuckled. One of them, a lanky spotter, poked his head in. "Come on, Preacher, let 'em be. They're the detail, we're the artists." Preacher ignored him, his slate-gray eyes now fixed on Maya. He was waiting for a reaction, a blush of embarrassment, a flicker of anger. He got neither. Maya simply placed the cleaned bolt back into its receiver with a soft, definitive click. She finally looked up, her gaze steady and calm. The rifle is a tool. A dirty tool is an unreliable tool. An unreliable tool gets people killed. That's all there is to it. Preacher's smirk widened. He saw her calmness not as confidence, but as meekness, the ingrained deference of a support soldier. He decided to push harder. He walked over to the rack where the rifles for the next relay were zeroed and ready. He picked one up, his personal M110 semi-automatic sniper system, a beautiful and terrifying piece of machinery. He held it out to her, not to hand over, but to display. "This," he said, "isn't just a tool. It's an instrument. You have to feel the wind in your bones, taste the dust in the air. You have to become one with it." He looked back at her workbench, at her loop and cleaning rods, and his voice dripped with a performative pity. "You spend all your time with their guts spilled out on a table. You know their anatomy, but you've never felt one breeze, have you?" The air in the tent grew thick. The chuckling outside had stopped. Everyone was watching the quiet armorer and the brash sniper. Maya's hands stilled on the rifle she was reassembling. She felt a familiar, quiet burn in her chest. It wasn't anger at the insult, it was frustration at the fundamental misunderstanding. He saw her work as menial, as separate from the act of shooting. He didn't understand that her work was the act of shooting, just the first and most crucial part. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the rifle down and stood up. She was shorter than him by a head, but in that moment she seemed to fill the space. She didn't need to defend herself with words. The truth was in the rifles she prepped, in the scores her shooters consistently posted. But Preacher wasn't done. He saw her standing and misinterpreted it as a sign he'd finally gotten under her skin. He loved to perform, and this audience was perfect. He turned to his spotter and the few others who had gathered, his voice loud enough for the whole range to hear. "See? Even the ghost in the machine has a pulse." He then looked back at Maya, the smirk now a full-blown, arrogant grin. He gestured with his chin toward the firing line, where the 1,000-meter targets were set up, shimmering in the heat haze. "All right then, armorer. You know their guts so well. Show us you can land this shot. With my instrument." He held out his own rifle, the M110, a challenge in his eyes. It was a cruel gambit. He was betting everything on the stereotype that the support personnel, the pogues, couldn't shoot. He was betting that her world was the bench, not the battlefield. He was daring her to fail in front of both divisions. The murmur of the crowd grew. Someone from her own battalion started to step forward to tell Preacher to back off, but a sharp look from Sergeant Major Harrison, who had materialized from the shadows of the tent, froze him in his tracks. The old man just watched, his face unreadable. Maya looked from Preacher's arrogant face to the rifle in his hands. It was a beautiful weapon, finely tuned, but it wasn't hers. She didn't know its trigger pull, its specific harmonic quirks, its soul. He was setting her up. Yet the quiet burn in her chest had spread to her limbs, a steady, familiar warmth. It was the same feeling she got when she was about to solve a complex problem with a rifle's action. This was just another problem, a different kind of fine-tuning. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out and took the heavy rifle from him. The crowd went silent. The weight of it was familiar, yet alien. She could feel the minute differences immediately. The slightly thicker pistol grip, the more aggressive texture on the forend. She ignored Preacher's triumphant look. She ignored the whispers. She turned the rifle over in her hands, her fingers tracing its lines not with reverence for the shooter, but with the analytical eye of a mechanic. She checked the scope mounts, solid. She cycled the action, smooth, but with a different spring tension than she was used to. She looked downrange at the distant target. It was a simple silhouette, a man-shaped outline at 1,000 yards. The heat haze made it dance and wobble, a mirage that could fool an unprepared eye. Without asking permission, she walked out of the tent and toward the firing line. The crowd parted for her like water around a stone. Preacher followed, his smirk now a little uncertain, his spotter trailing behind with a look of dawning apprehension. The range safety officer, a warrant officer from the 1st Armored, looked confused. "What's this?" "She's going to show us how it's done," Preacher announced, his voice laced with a new tension. He was no longer in control of his own performance. Maya didn't acknowledge the RSO. She walked to the firing point for the 1,000-meter lane. It was a concrete slab with a sandbag rest. She ignored the fancy shooting mat Preacher's spotter had laid out. Instead, she knelt. She placed the rifle on the sandbag, but she didn't immediately settle in behind it. She closed her eyes. She wasn't praying. She was listening. She was feeling the faint breeze on her cheek, tasting the grit in the air, sensing the temperature. She was calibrating herself, becoming one with the environment, just as Preacher had arrogantly claimed to do. Then, she opened her eyes. She took one more look at the rifle in her hands, but she wasn't looking at it as Preacher's instrument anymore. She was looking at it as a collection of parts, a system she understood intrinsically, even if she didn't know its history. She adjusted the cheek rest minutely, a modification of a fraction of an inch. She settled in behind the scope. The world narrowed. The whispers of the crowd, the distant crack of other rifles, the wind, it all faded into a muffled static. Her entire universe became the blurry, dancing silhouette 1,000 yards away and the crosshairs that seemed to float in space. Her finger found the trigger. It was heavier than hers, grittier. She noted it, adjusted her mental model, and began to apply pressure. She didn't jerk it. She didn't anticipate the recoil. She simply increased the pressure, smoothly, constantly, letting the break be a surprise. The report of the M110 was a sharp, deafening crack that echoed across the range. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and comforting punch. The crowd gasped, then fell silent, waiting. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The target remained upright. A wave of relieved smirks began to spread among Preacher's men. Preacher himself let out a small, condescending puff of air. Then, the shot's impact registered. The distant steel target, a man-sized silhouette, didn't just wobble. It swung violently backward on its hinge, the sound of the impact, a solid, satisfying clang, reaching them a full second and a half after the crack of the rifle. It was a perfect hit. Center mass, the hardest shot on the range. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound that Maya could hear the ringing in her own ears. She slowly eased her finger out of the trigger guard, flipped on the safety, and laid the rifle back down on the sandbag. She stood up, her knees popping. She didn't look at the target. She didn't need to. She already knew. She finally turned to face the crowd. Her eyes scanned past the stunned faces of the 1st Armored soldiers and found Preacher. His smirk was gone, completely erased. His slate-gray eyes were wide, his jaw slack. He looked not at her, but at his rifle on the sandbag, as if it had betrayed him, as if it had somehow willed itself to make that shot. Maya walked past him, brushing by his shoulder without a word. She walked back into the armory tent, the canvas flap falling shut behind her, blocking out the stunned crowd and the humiliated sniper. She went back to her workbench, sat down on her stool, and picked up the rifle she had been assembling. She inserted the magazine, pulled the charging handle to chamber a round, and checked the safety. She then looked up at Sergeant Major Harrison, who hadn't moved from his spot. He just looked at her, a slow, rare grin cracking his weathered face. He gave her a single, respectful nod. Maya simply nodded back and returned to her work, the quiet hours her own again. She hadn't needed to say a word. The rifle, any rifle, in the right hands, had a voice of its own. And today, it had spoken for her.